Hello and welcome to Healthy Bites. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich, where each week I do a short post or story about the previous podcast or an article that I've read or a workshop that I've attended and I wanted to share with you. I wanted to share with you quite an incredible, I thought, period of the weekend just passed, a 12 to 14 hour period where I seemed to fit quite a lot in, and I wanted to share that with you. It started on Friday night with a great evening meeting, lecture, panel discussion in Fairlight, sponsored by Fairlight Butcher, Ryan and his team, and it was called Soil to Stomach, and the keynote speaker was the legendary, and I think he is an absolute legend, Charlie Massey. Now, Charlie has written a wonderful book called The Call of the Reed Warbler, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I'm a dentist, and I can only imagine the impact that that's had for people on the farms, and it has really changed people's lives and is changing people's lives day by day as more and more people read it. Charlie was the keynote speaker and gave a great presentation. Then on Saturday morning, about 8 o'clock, I went over to Dr. Lewis Ehrlich's place, and we again had an ice bath. What a great way to start a Saturday morning. I'll talk to you about that. And after the ice bath, we headed over to Balgowlah for an introductory workshop on biodynamics with Charlie Arnott and Hamish Mackay. It was quite a time and seemed to fit an awful lot in. I wanted to share some of those things with you. Firstly, the lecture on Friday night. Now, Charlie Massey talks about 5 cycles that we need to all be aware of in this world of regenerative agriculture. And Charlie, I remember when I spoke to him on the podcast, pointed out that the word sustainable, which is gaining a lot of attention, and rightly so, but he takes issue with it to some degree and says the soils and the land and the environment is actually already quite degraded. So sustaining that is not enough. What we actually need to do is regenerate, and regeneration is important. Now, part of that regenerative process, and if you're watching this on YouTube, and I'd encourage you to do that because I got a couple of slides from the evening. I wish I had the whole presentation, but a couple that I wanted to share with you. But if you're listening to this just on audio, it'll work as well. But one of the most important regenerative tools is cows. And it's not the cow, but it's the how that is the problem. And I know animals are coming up for a lot of criticism, and rightly so. The way they are managed is the problem. But cows, ruminants, are such a critical part of our natural cycle and our ability to not only preserve but regenerate soil and healthy soils. They are mowers, they are inoculators, they are fertilisers, and they are massagers of the ground. They mow the ground. They've got 3 stomachs which break down all of that cellulose in grass and leaf matter, and are full of microbes. They then defecate, and not only do they defecate, but then they trample and aerate and massage the soil. So they are really important. Now, Charlie talks about various cycles, and he talks about 5 cycles. The first cycle is the solar cycle, which is all about what we all learnt in first year high school. Now, I just heard that Elon Musk has given a reward of $100 million to the first engineer that works out a way of sequestering carbon from the environment and reversing the carbon dioxide in the environment, which is causing global warming. Well, if a Year 7 student is paying attention, they could claim that $100 million because we all learnt about photosynthesis, and that is the sun shines, it shines on leaf, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, mixing it with water, putting carbohydrate into the soil, carbohydrate, which is a carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, and that is a great way of sequestering carbon. So as much leaf cover as possible, as much as vegetation as possible is the best way of taking advantage of what Charlie Massey calls the solar cycle. The second function, the second cycle, is the water cycle. If a land has been cleared and fertilised, then water just, and dries out, then water just does not penetrate. And in fact, another guest of mine, Graham Rees, in one of the podcasts we did, once said to me that on denuded soil, which you typically see in any tilled soil, it takes between 10 and 30 minutes for water to penetrate into in 1 inch of that soil. And in fact, Charlie made the point that it may not penetrate at all. It could sit there for hours, or it could just wash away the soil and the water. The two biggest resources that a farmer has is the soil on which he grows his food, and the water, which is an important part of that cycle. But on denuded soil, on poorly managed soil, not only does he lose soil, but he loses water. And in rich organic soil with a lot of life in it, water will penetrate in the first 10 to 30 seconds. And he showed this amazing slide of exactly the same block of land that had been poorly managed in 1980, and there's a pond with brown earth surrounding it and very little vegetation on it. And then 2007, after it had been subject to 27 years of holistic land management, you just you would not know that these are the same blocks of land, and I'd encourage you to have a look at it. So what's the secret to that? Well, it's what goes on under the soil. And we have this adversarial approach to microbes and fungi, and if we can just promote microbes and fungi to enrich the soil, then we have a soil mineral balance, which is the third cycle that Charlie talks about, which just provides so much of the nutrient-dense foods that we need to be healthy. And he showed some great slides of that and showed what mycorrhizal fungi are. And he once said to me, in a teaspoon of healthy soil, you have 1 billion microbes and, wait for it, 27,000 kilometres of mycorrhizal fungi. They're the fine hairs that fungi put out to break down soil and produce and break down soil and rocks to produce the minerals that go into the plants. In a healthy cubic metre of soil, there is 27,000 kilometres of hyphae. And in a healthy teaspoon of soil, there's 1 billion microbes. And when you use herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, there's none of that. And that's why the water just rolls off along with the soil. And he shows again some examples of regeneration. And we saw examples of that in our visit to Uralla last year, where we were driving down a road, and on one side of the road was a regenerative farm where, yes, it was dry and brown at the it was actually the beginning of 2019 at the height of the drought, and on one side was vegetation, dry, yes, it was brown, but it was covered with vegetation, and on the other side was literally bare earth with a few animals grazing across what might have been 100 acres of land. So poorly managed land on one side and on the other side. So we had the solar cycle, the water cycle, the soil mineral cycle by the microbes in the soil, which brought in the fourth cycle, which was biodiversity. And ultimately, the more diverse the vegetation is, the more diverse the microbiome is, the more resilient the land is and the healthier the land is. And that's true of the gut microbiome, the soil microbiome, the mouth microbiome, and I think it's a great metaphor for life in general. However, the fifth cycle that Charlie that talks about is the human social cycle, which involves you and me and every farmer and every consumer in the world. It's the decisions that they all make. What goes on between our ears is perhaps the most important cycle of all, because if we don't embrace this, if we don't drive this along, then we are not going to effect change. And ultimately, That's where we have our greatest power. We get to vote 3 or 4 times, once every 3 or 4 years, but every single day in almost every decision we make, we get to vote every single day with our dollars, and I don't think we need to argue about money talks. It certainly does. It's what drives decisions and economies, and so by making decisions and supporting butchers like Fairlight Butcher, or in ethical farmers, or Feather and Bone. I got to meet Grant Hilliard at Feather and Bone, which was terrific, and I'm looking forward to hopefully getting him on as a guest to discuss his wonderful book, The Ethical Omnivore, or Dom O'Neill with Ethical Farmers, or on Bondi Road, Sam the Butcher. Look, there's lots of this is happening, and decisions that we make. I remember many years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, I live in Bronte in Sydney, in the suburb next to Bondi, and I walked into my local butcher, Lucas Butchery, and I remember about 15 years ago asking them, is the beef they sell grass-fed and finished? And the guy looked at me like I had just been talking a completely different language, looked like I was crazy. I thought he was going to take a knife to me. Anyway, he said, I don't know, yeah, why? Why? And I said, because it's really important. Anyway, I didn't end up buying my meat there, but I do now, because I've seen that in recent times he actually advertises on the window. It may have taken 10 years for him to get around to it, but he now advertises on his window grass-fed and finished beef. Good on him. I really admire that. And that's what I mean about driving change. Walking into your butcher and asking those kind of questions. Really important. So Charlie was talking about a whole range of things, about agricultural practices, about complex adaptive systems, allowing the soil to heal, enabling nature to work rather than trying to dominate it. And he talked about the Great Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, edited by Paul Hawken, who is another person I'd love to get onto my podcast. And he talks about regenerative agriculture as being a very important part of that. And Charlie also talked about how deficient our soils were. We talk about nutrient-dense foods and how deficient soils are in all those. There are 60 elements that we need to be healthy. You might remember that podcast I did. If you don't, go back and listen to Fred Provenza, who wrote that terrific book called Nourishment. And Fred talked about primary and secondary nutrients within plants, and how deficient the soils are, and the secondary nutrients, the phytonutrients. I remember Charlie showed this photo of strawberries, and I remember Fred Provenza, he's just a lovely guy and so knowledgeable. Fred said, in the humble strawberry, there are 5,000 chemicals, phytonutrients, phytochemicals, that make up that one food source. And we don't know what most of them do, but we know natural food is healthy for us. That's why. And the mineral depletion that has gone on in this industrial agriculture is profound. And I'm just showing some slides that kind of Charlie shared. And the whole use of fertilizers and pesticides, particularly glyphosate, is really a problem. Glyphosate is a huge problem. It's a chelator. It interferes with some important pathways. It's a huge disruptor to the gut microbiome. It's water soluble and therefore can penetrate the gut barrier and the blood-brain barrier, and it has severe epigenetic effects. So the impacts of glyphosate are huge, and Charlie talked about that and made reference to Professor Don Huber, who I will also be putting on my list to invite. So these were just some of the pathways that Charlie talked about. And, we have a lot to learn from our ancestors. So these regenerative cycles are really important. Now, Charlie referenced President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who came to power in 1932, and apart from a depression, there was a drought on, and the Dust Bowl in America lost a great deal of soil from poor land management. 2 metres of soil is just incredible when you consider that it takes nature 500 years to produce 2 centimetres of soil. Now, 500 years to produce 2 centimetres of soil, well, 2 metres of soil is 100 times more than that, so what is 100 times more than 500? I think that's about 50,000 years of soil gone. Whereas regenerative agriculture, animals, ruminants that are managed well, remember, it's not the cow, it's the how. Regenerative agriculture has the ability to produce 2 centimetres of soil in 3 to 5 years. So that is pretty impressive, and that's why we all need to be supporting it. I was so honoured to be on the panel at the end of the day, and there was, there was some great people that I met there. There were over 100 people there. What a great night, what a great energy. Soil to stomach. It was great. And it was chaired by, of course, Charlie Arnott. Now, one of the things that is interesting is to consider change. Why change is so difficult for people. And I think about this a lot. I include it in a lot of my courses, because if we are trying to affect change in an individual from one type of behaviour to a better behaviour for their health, then exploring what are the barriers to change is an important one. And when I look at regenerative agriculture, I see the same thing. That road that I drove down in Uralla, where on one side of the road the regenerative farm was clearly, to the untrained eye, it was like a different planet. It was there was vegetation. Yes, it was dry, but the ground was covered with vegetation, shrubs, trees, grasses. On the other side of the road, there was dust and the odd animal, poorly managed animal. And the question is, what is going through that farmer's mind on the dust side that doesn't allow him to make the change to the other side? And the same is true for any individual looking at change. So the story of change is a really important one. And in my opinion, change is difficult for people depending on their attitude to it. Some people view change as a rejection of the past, of what has gone before, of what their parents, what universities had taught them. We love certainty, and when our parents tell us something, when we learn something at university, when we have it mandated to us, we love the certainty of that. And yet, if we are going to change, then that means we have to reject some of that advice. And so that rejection is very difficult for people to accept and incorporate into their lives. So they reject the new way of doing things. I prefer to see change as being a progression, a building on what our past has taught us, using thought and observation and the latest science to incorporate the information from the past with the observations of the present and how we want to move forward into the future. So I actually find it empowering when I'm confronted with challenges which say, hey, I think you need to change the way you're thinking about this. But not everybody sees it that way. Many people see it as a threat. The other thing that I think is really interesting is when we look at changes, do you see your life, what is the locus of control in your life? Do you see yourself as being an integral and an important driver of that control? We don't have full control over things in our lives. We don't have control over world events. We don't have control over other people. We do have control about how we think about those things. So is your locus of control internal, accepting that you have some control and hopefully a lot of control? Or do you view things as being, I just have no control over what's going on. I'm a victim of the whole environment and the people that surround me, and I have an external locus of control. So if you are open to change, you have an internal locus of control and accept that you are an important driver in what controls your life. If you are resistant to change, then you view things as having an external locus of control. This is what my parents taught me. This is what the universities taught me. This is what the government mandates. This is what the environment is. I have no control over any of that. So that is an external locus of control, and you would be resistant to change. The other aspect of change is a tolerance of ambiguity. Now, what I mean by that is, and as I've said, we love certainty. We love certainty. It's so much easier if there are simple solutions, good and evil, bad, right and wrong, black and white. That is a way of looking at the world which is very simple and easy, if you like. Whereas a tolerance of ambiguity recognises that things aren't always black and white. There are lots of shades of grey in between that. And if you've got a tolerance of ambiguity, you don't feel threatened by these things. You actually feel empowered by them. And as I've said many times, I feel empowered by all the things that I learn. And as I learn, I realise that there's an awful lot I don't know. In fact, as I've said many times, the more you learn, the more you realise you don't know. Some people find that threatening, and some people find it very upsetting and it's disquieting, if you like. But I actually find that empowering. I find that quite exciting. And my role, and that's why I use the word holistic, and I have done for so many years, is to try and make sense of how that fits into a whole pattern. And having said that, when somebody tells me that something is 100% true, I take that with a grain of salt. So, this is about how you view change. Is it a rejection of the past, or is it a building on the future? Do you have an internal or an external locus of control? And do you have a tolerance of ambiguity? And they are the elements that I believe we need to look at when we're seeing people that are into change or those that are resistant to change. Now, I've talked about hormesis, and after that workshop, which we got home about 10 o'clock at night, but we were up bright and early the next morning, and at 8 o'clock the next morning I went over with my 3 bags of ice, because everybody that comes over to Dr. Lewis Ehrlich's place on a Saturday morning has to bring 3 bags of ice. And the Sulo bin, this is a new Sulo bin, not an old one that's been used for rubbish. We've got a new Sulo bin, half fill it up, throw the ice in, and we start by doing the Wim Hof breathing technique, which is such an interesting thing. This is hormesis in action just by using your breath. And the more I learn about breathing, the more incredible I think it is. And I've often said the secret to living a long life is to keep breathing for as long as you can. But there is a very big difference between breathing and breathing well. And I've talked about what breathing well throughout the day is. Slow breathing, gentle breathing through the nose from the diaphragm. So that is how we should be breathing through the day. But we can use breath to put our body under stress. And Wim Hof, who I'd love to get on, I did speak to Dino Gladstone. Go back and have a listen to the Dino Gladstone interview that I did on this, and we're going to be exploring this more as the year goes on. But the breathing technique we did while we were waiting for the water to cool down, because it was only when we threw the ice in after about 5 minutes, it was 10 degrees. By the time we'd finished our 3 sets of breathing exercises, it got down to about 5 degrees. And this is what we did. We followed, he's got a great app. I'll have the links to that app if you like. And the Wim Hof app runs you through a breathing exercise which basically gets you to do the opposite of what we do during the day. Remember I said slow, gentle, through the nose, from the diaphragm breathing? Well, Wim Hof does exactly the opposite. He does fast, full breaths, in and out, in and out. Doing that 30 times, and then asking you to inhale once and hold the breath, and get you to hold your breath for a minute, then a minute and a half, then if you can, up to 2 minutes. And if you're really good, you might get a little bit beyond 2 minutes, and then slowly release the breath and have a gentle breath. That's 1 set, and we repeat that 3 times. And what that does, and I'm still learning about this, is it changes our body neurology. It puts us into sympathetic overdrive. It puts our body under stress, intentional stress. It changes the acid-alkali balance in our body. And then we got into the ice bath. And what I found really interesting about the ice bath is, and as I think I've mentioned to you before, I hate cold water. I probably wouldn't go into the sea, although I'm trying to man up a bit here and try and be a little bit more harder than I am. I shouldn't say man up, because my wife gets into the cold water much more readily than I do. But anyway, toughen up. Let's put it that way. Toughen up. I generally don't get into the water in the sea if it's under 18, but here I am getting into between 2 and 5 degrees, and I have to concentrate. And when I concentrate, yes, the first minute or so is cold, but then surprisingly, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. And we do that 2 or 3 times. And the first time I did it, I was surprised that I was able to stay in the tub for 3.5 minutes. The second time I got in on that first session, I got really cocky and I started to talk to those around me going, wow, I just think this is incredible. And what I realized was, as I was talking, I became really cold. And I had to stop talking and focus again on my breathing, and my whole mind controlled that. So this has been a really interesting thing to do, and we're doing it regularly. And as I said to you, hormesis is the idea of putting your body under intentional stress, and that intentional stress can be ice baths, infrared saunas, exercise, fasting, and we're going to be exploring each of those things. So that was my Saturday morning, and after we got off, we left there around 9:30 and made it to Balgowlah for Charlie Arnott and Hamish Mackay's introductory workshop on biodynamics. And I've been fascinated by this for some time. I know very little about it. It was great to get this introductory talk about the various levels of the physical, the ethereal, the astral, all these different levels. And, you know, it's talking about being in touch with nature and the energy that surrounds us. And to some people, this may seem a little bit, like it's a little bit out there on the edge. But in fact, the fact that astral bodies and the fact that the atmosphere has an effect shouldn't surprise us. Remember, the sun comes up every morning, and the sun is, although it's 93 million miles away, it's pretty important to our everyday life. What about the moon? A couple of 100,000 kilometres away? What about the moon? Does it have an impact? Damn right it does. It happens to move whole oceans and affect tide. So could the moon have an effect on agriculture? I'm going to learn more about that. This is what I mean about having an open mind to these sort of things. So I just love Charlie Arnott's. I could sit and listen to Charlie all day. A great guy, lots of knowledge, and Hamish, of course, obviously very knowledgeable in the area of biodynamics. And there we were in the Scout Hall, and just making the point that there's a difference between Newtonian physics, which is really easy to understand. This idea when you push against something, it moves. There are equal and opposite reactions, Physics from the 18th century, it was all about Newtonian physics. But of course, along came quantum physics, and I'm not even going to try and explain quantum physics, but quantum physics is the way the world works, and it's full of contradictions. It's all about energy, it's all about atoms, it's all about atomic energy, and so it's a far more subtle force that is affected. And this was a fascinating thing. And then we learnt about humus, and we learnt about how to use the humus, make it, and how to use it. And this was just Hamish demonstrating how to do this, to put some of that humus into a bucket of water and to stir it around, and then to spread that liquid around the garden. Now, interestingly, my wife and I did a humus workshop about 25 years ago with Chris Miliotis. Now, Chris, we did a podcast with also, and we did the humus workshop with him where we learnt to put humus into a bucket, only a handful, and stir it. So this is full of microbes and really healthy microbes. And stir it, and then take a brush and flick it almost like holy water around our property. And we were living we had a really big garden in Bronte, but it was really sandy soil, really poor soil. And we definitely noticed an improvement in our soil, and we were doing that in that area. But I want to learn more about the workshop. And this was Hamish spreading it, and I was there with my son-in-law, Sam Betteridge, who's a permaculture educator and also the education officer at Pocket City Farm. And I was there with Dr. Ron Ehrlich, and we just had a great morning there as an introduction. And I would love to go down and do Charlie Arnott and Hamish Mackay's program on biodynamics. And for that matter, I'd love to catch up with Terry McCosker, who I also did a workshop, a podcast with, and do his regenerative agriculture program as well. So that was my day from Friday evening at 6 o'clock through to Saturday morning at 1 o'clock. Fitted in quite a lot, and I wanted to share that with you. I hope you find that healthy bite or bites informative and inspiring. I hope this finds you well. And until then, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.